December 1944. Europe was exhausted. 5 years into the most destructive war in human history, the continent was in ruins. Nazi Germany had been driven out of France, retreating eastward across the River Rhine. The Allied advance had slowed, but most believed the end was near. American forces controlled most of Western Europe. The Red Army was closing in from the east. Adolf Hitler's empire was shrinking. In the American camps dotting the Belgian countryside, soldiers looked forward to Christmas. Many believed the war would be over by spring. The front had gone quiet. The Ardennes Forest, a rugged, heavily wooded stretch spanning Belgium and Luxembourg, was considered a ghost front. Thinly held by Green American divisions, it was quiet, cold, and uneventful. But under the blanket of winter and complacency, the Germans were preparing a final strike. Hitler had a plan, one born of desperation and fading hope. He would gather every remaining reserve, armor, infantry, SS, and launch a surprise offensive through the Ardennes. It was a gamble. His objective: punch through the American line, drive west toward the Meuse River, capture the port of Antwerp, and split the Allied armies in two. He hoped to force a separate peace in the west and turn his full attention back to the Soviet front. He called it Wacht am Rhein, Operation Watch on the Rhine, a name designed to fool Allied intelligence into thinking it was defensive in nature. In reality, it was the largest German offensive in the West since 1940. Three German armies, the 6th SS Panzer Army under Sepp Dietrich, the 5th Panzer Army under Hasso von Manteuffel, and the 7th Army under Erich Brandenberger, were assembled in secrecy. Over 400,000 troops, 1,400 tanks and assault guns, and more than 2,000 artillery pieces and rocket launchers were positioned along a 75-mile front. They moved only at night. Orders were issued by courier. Even frontline commanders weren't told the full plan until days before the attack. Facing them were just 80,000 American troops. Many were fresh replacements or battle-weary infantry resting after the campaigns in France. Scattered across thin lines, they had no idea what was coming. And then came December 16th. At 5:30 a.m. in the pre-dawn darkness, the sky lit up with a roar. Over 1,000 German guns opened fire in a thunderous artillery barrage. The shelling stretched across the entire front, from Monschau in the north to Echternach in the south. It was deafening. Trees shattered, trenches collapsed, communications lines were severed, confusion spread like wildfire. Then, through the mist and snow, German armor rolled forward. Tiger tanks, Panthers, Panzer I-4s, supported by armored infantry and half-tracks and motorcycles, poured through the broken lines. The 277th, 326th, and 62nd Volksgrenadier divisions surged into U.S. positions. Entire American platoons were wiped out. Others were surrounded. Some units held their ground with incredible bravery. Others were overrun within hours. In the north, near Monschau and the Elsenborn Ridge, the 2nd and 99th Infantry Divisions dug in and resisted. Their stubborn defense would prove crucial in the days to come. Further south, around St. Vith, the 106th Infantry Division, barely a week into the line, was struck with overwhelming force. Two of its regiments were surrounded, cut off, and eventually captured. Over 7,000 men surrendered, the largest U.S. mass surrender of the European theater. Meanwhile, in the small town of Malmedy, an American convoy was captured by an SS Panzer unit under Joachim Peiper. What happened next would become one of the most infamous war crimes of the Western Front. At least 84 American prisoners were machine-gunned in a snowy field, the Malmedy Massacre. News of the massacre would later spread quickly among U.S. troops, hardening their resolve and changing how many would treat surrendering SS soldiers. But as chaos spread, one place held the line: Bastogne. A vital crossroads town in southern Belgium, Bastogne controlled access to 7 major roads. If the Germans wanted to break through to the Meuse River, they needed Bastogne. The Americans knew it too, and within hours, orders were issued: hold Bastogne at all costs. Paratroopers from the 101st Airborne Division, still resting after their brutal fight in Holland, were told to move. They were rushed to the front by truck, racing through snow-covered roads and bypassing refugees fleeing the German advance. They arrived without winter gear, without enough ammunition, without artillery support, and soon they would be surrounded. But they had one mission: hold the town. The 101st Airborne Division had been resting and refitting after brutal fighting in Operation Market Garden. Many of its soldiers were recovering from wounds. Their equipment was incomplete, their winter gear had not arrived, and yet, within hours of receiving the order, they were on trucks, heading toward Bastogne. The town itself was a strategic prize. Every major road in southern Belgium ran through Bastogne. For the Germans, it was the gateway to the Meuse River and beyond. For the Americans, it was the anchor point of a collapsing front. As the paratroopers arrived, they found a town already in a state of panic. Civilians were fleeing, roads were jammed. Stragglers and wounded flooded the streets. The 10th Armored Division had already engaged German forces outside the town, buying critical time. Together, the armor and airborne troops set up a defensive perimeter, a ring around Bastogne, stretching into the snowy woods, manned by rifle squads, artillery batteries, and hastily positioned anti-tank guns. And then the snow came. Temperatures plummeted to near zero. Fog rolled in. The skies turned gray and heavy. The snow blanketed everything, softening the terrain, muffling the sounds of war, and creating the illusion of stillness. But beneath the silence, men were digging foxholes, laying mines, zeroing rifles. They knew what was coming. By December 20th, Bastogne was completely surrounded. German troops had encircled the town, cutting off all supply lines. The American defenders were trapped, but they did not surrender. Inside Bastogne, conditions deteriorated rapidly. Food was rationed, medical supplies ran short, there was no morphine, no bandages. Wounded men lay in barns and basements, some dying slowly from infection and cold. The town's few remaining doctors and medics worked day and night without rest. Yet morale held. Discipline was firm, and everywhere men were preparing for the fight. The 327th Glider Infantry, the 501st, 506th, and 502nd Parachute Infantry regiments of the 101st took up positions along the perimeter. They dug into frozen soil with bayonets, mess kits, or bare hands. Each sector was assigned, each approach covered, and they waited. The Germans came soon enough. Waves of infantry, supported by tanks and artillery, launched probing attacks against every side of Bastogne. In villages like Neuville, Marvy, and Luzery, American paratroopers met them with fire and steel. At times they were forced back, at times they counterattacked. Tanks dueled in narrow lanes. Bazooka teams waited in the ruins of barns. Mortar crews fired until their tubes overheated. Then, on December 22nd, a German delegation approached the lines under a white flag. They carried a written ultimatum. The defenders of Bastogne were to surrender or face complete and utter destruction. The message was delivered to Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe, acting commander of the 101st. His response was a single word: nuts. The word confused the German officers. They didn't understand the slang, but the meaning became clear. The Americans weren't giving up. The siege intensified. In the woods around Bastogne, the Germans brought forward heavy guns, 80s artillery, even Nebelwerfer rocket launchers. Shells rained down day and night. Buildings collapsed. Churches burned. Men shivered in foxholes, their breath freezing in midair. Ammunition was running low. Artillery shells were rationed. Machine gun belts were counted by the dozen. Still, the Americans held. Meanwhile, to the north, the fight was just as fierce. At Elsenborn Ridge, elements of the 2nd and 99th Infantry Divisions held a key position that blocked the northern German advance. For days, outnumbered and outgunned, they dug in and repelled attack after attack. Snow-covered hills became killing fields. The ridge held, and by holding it, they forced German armor to reroute, delaying the entire operation and giving time for a counteroffensive to form. At St. Vith, a key road junction further east, the 7th Armored Division and elements of the 106th Infantry Division slowed the German push for days. Though eventually surrounded and forced to withdraw, their resistance forced the Germans to alter their plans again. Every day the Germans were delayed was a day closer to relief, and General George Patton was already on the move. As Bastogne held on by its fingertips, surrounded by fire and snow, General George S. Patton was already doing what most said was impossible, turning an entire army 90 degrees in the middle of winter to punch through German lines and break the siege. Patton had long sensed the Germans were planning something. When the attack came, he was ready to pivot. Days before the orders were even given, he had already tasked his staff with contingency plans. And when Supreme Allied Commander Dwight D. Eisenhower asked how fast he could get to Bastogne, Patton answered without blinking, I can attack with 3 divisions in 48 hours. People in the room laughed. Then Patton did it. From Metz and points further south, Patton's Third Army, including the 4th Armored Division, the 26th Infantry Division, and the 81st Infantry Division, began a furious race northward. Convoys moved day and night through narrow, ice covered roads. Tanks spun out on black ice. Trucks slid into ditches. Men rode on open top vehicles with no protection from the freezing wind. But they kept moving. Along the way, supply lines had to be rebuilt, bridges repaired, mines cleared. Entire battalions leapfrogged through the countryside to keep pressure on the enemy and momentum in the march. It was, by every measure, a logistical masterpiece, a fusion of willpower, aggression, and organization that only Patton could orchestrate. Meanwhile, Bastogne was still under siege. German artillery pummeled the town daily. The fog hung thick in the air. Snow fell without end. The wounded filled every building. Supplies were dangerously low. Some American units had only a few rounds per rifle. Artillery shells were counted and rationed. Medical units operated with no morphine and no anesthesia. And yet the defenders never folded. They rotated lines every few days, dug deeper into the frozen ground, set booby traps, coordinated artillery fire by map alone, and every man knew what was at stake. Bastogne was the cork in the bottle. If it broke, the whole line could unravel. Then, finally, the skies cleared. On December 23rd, the weather lifted, and with it came the U.S. Army Air Forces. C-47 transport planes dropped tons of medical supplies, food, ammo, and even warm clothing by parachute into the center of town. Fighter bombers strafed and bombed German artillery positions. P-47 Thunderbolts screamed in low, blasting tanks with rockets and machine gun fire. For the first time in days, the men in Bastogne looked up and felt hope, but the German noose was still tight. On Christmas Eve, the Germans launched a massive assault. Tigers, Panthers, and infantry attacked from multiple directions. The 101st and attached units held fast. Foxholes turned into mass graves. Every field was a minefield. But by Christmas morning, they were still holding. Then came the day they'd all been waiting for. On December 26th, a task force from Patton's 4th Armored Division, led by Lieutenant Colonel Creighton Abrams, the man who would one day have a tank named after him, reached the southern edge of Bastogne near the village of Assenois. They slammed through German lines, blasted roadblocks, and roared into town just after dark. The siege was broken. Men from the 101st, dirty, unshaven, and half frozen, stood on the roads and watched the tanks roll in. There was no cheering, no parade, just quiet nods and firm handshakes. They had done their job, and now the fight would continue. But Bastogne was more than a victory. It was a symbol, proof that the American line could not be broken, that even surrounded without air support and outgunned, U.S. soldiers could hold and win. Patton's maneuver, his ability to redirect an army in days through impossible terrain and weather, became legend. It was studied in war colleges and praised by friend and foe alike. Even German commanders admitted later that once Bastogne was relieved, their offensive had no chance. From that point forward, the momentum shifted. Allied forces began a slow but determined pushback across the entire front. The Bulge, which had pushed 50 miles into Allied territory, began to flatten. But the cost had been staggering, and the fight was far from over. As 1945 began, the tide of the Battle of the Bulge had turned, but the war was not yet won. Though Patton's tanks had punched through to Bastogne and the skies had cleared for Allied air superiority, German forces still occupied vast sections of Belgium and Luxembourg. The bulge in the lines, nearly 50 miles deep at its peak, had not yet been erased. Bitter fighting continued across snow-covered hills, dense pine forests, and shattered villages. German forces were not retreating easily. Hitler had refused to withdraw, demanding that his units stand and fight. But fuel shortages, logistical breakdowns, and mounting losses crippled any chance of success. Many of the tanks that had spearheaded the offensive were now abandoned, out of fuel, stuck in ditches, or blown apart by Allied airstrikes. American and British forces regrouped and began the push to reclaim lost ground. The attack came from both north and south, squeezing the German salient into an ever-narrowing corridor. Towns like Houffalize, Manhay, and La Roche-en-Ardennes became targets of heavy fighting. The roads were choked with wreckage, trees splintered by artillery, the dead frozen in place, enemy and ally alike. It was a slow, painful advance. Fierce German rearguard actions slowed progress, but they couldn't stop it. American units, now reinforced and rearmed, pressed forward relentlessly. The 1st, 2nd, and 3rd Armored Divisions moved alongside the 82nd and 101st Airborne, the 4th Infantry Division, and countless other regiments that had endured weeks of cold, hunger, and loss. By late January, the Bulge had been erased. The front lines returned to roughly where they had been before December 16th, but everything had changed. The Germans had spent their last reserves. Elite SS Panzer divisions were shattered. Thousands of irreplaceable soldiers and tanks were gone. Their ability to launch another large-scale offensive in the West was over. The Wehrmacht would remain on the defensive until the end of the war. American casualties were staggering. Over 89,000 U.S. soldiers were killed, wounded, or captured during the 5-week battle. It was the single bloodiest campaign ever fought by the United States Army. More than 19,000 Americans died in the forests of the Ardennes. German losses are harder to calculate, but are estimated to be between 60,000 and 100,000, including dead, wounded, and missing. Many were never recovered. Some froze to death in their foxholes. Others were captured in shattered villages. Entire units vanished into the forest and were never heard from again. And then there were the civilians, Belgian villagers caught between two armies, entire towns reduced to rubble, families hiding in basements, children starving as food supplies vanished, farmers watching their homes become tank traps, their fields turned into graveyards. The winter of 1944 to 1945 left deep scars across Europe. But through the devastation came resilience. The Battle of the Bulge became a defining moment for the American Army. It was a test of endurance, leadership, and grit. From the surrounded paratroopers of Bastogne to the exhausted tank crews of Patton's Third Army, the men who fought in the Ardennes wrote one of the most remarkable chapters in U.S. military history. It reshaped American military doctrine, reinforcing the importance of mobility, supply lines, and decentralized command. It validated the concept of combined arms, infantry, armor, artillery, and air power working together, and it reminded commanders of the unpredictable nature of war. Even in apparent victory, a desperate enemy could strike back. In the decades that followed, the men who fought in the Ardennes would remember the battle not just for the blood and snow, but for the brotherhood it forged, the foxholes they dug, the friends they lost. The warmth of a ration can in frozen hands, the silence that fell after the shelling stopped. They remembered the sound of Sherman tanks rolling in, the burst of tracer fire in the night, the frostbite, the fear, the resolve. Today, the forests of the Ardennes are quiet again. The towns have been rebuilt. Monuments stand where fire once fell. And in places like Bastogne, La Glaise, and Malmedy, museums and memorials tell the story of what happened there. Every year, veterans return. Some to remember, some to find closure, some simply to stand in the place where long ago they faced the impossible and held the line. The Battle of the Bulge was Hitler's last gamble. It failed, but the cost was high, the pain was real, and the legacy eternal.